Hello and welcome to my channel. We have a drawing of a boxing legend here, Manny Pacquiao, one of the greatest active boxers, one of the most accomplished boxers of all time. This was done mostly in charcoal, but also a bit of black colored pencil. The size of the paper is 9 times 12 inches or so, as usual. And as usual with most of my black and white drawings, like I said, I'm going to be using mostly charcoal. I'm going to be using these woodless charcoal pencils, some vine charcoal, and a bit of black colored pencil for some of the details, textures and things like that. For blending, I'm going to be using homemade tortillons, and for erasing, I'm going to be using a pencil eraser and a kneaded eraser. The usual tools, they're nothing special. You can use any brand. Don't ask me about the brands. I already talked about that. So as my sketch is progressing, let me comment a little bit on what I plan to do with the composition. You can see that I'm doing a bit of shading around some of the edges. So there's going to be a bit of contrast around some of the lighter areas on the light side of his body, and around those highlights I plan to create contrast by putting a bit of value onto the background. Normally I don't shade the background when I do portraits like this, but here I decided to put in a little bit of value so that I can create some additional contrast between those highlights around, for example, his right side of the face, or the neck and the shoulders. So I want my main subject to stand out, and one of the ways to do that is to put a bit of value, put a bit of that vine charcoal onto the background and add a bit of value to the background, and then you can have a nice contrast with those lighter areas. But I didn't put too much, and I also refined the edges a little bit using a black colored pencil just to make sure that they are clean enough. And after that I'm going to further refine them by using a pencil eraser, which is what I'm doing here. Pencil eraser is a convenient tool because you can sharpen it like a pencil. It's not quite as precise, the tip is not quite as fine, but it gets the job done because it gives you a lot of control, and you can draw some smaller, finer lines and smaller shapes, basically by taking away value. And here I'm moving on to drawing the hair. I'm using a medium charcoal pencil for this, and I'm paying attention that I create the proper texture while I'm drawing the hair, so I'm careful about the direction of my strokes as well as the length of the strokes. I don't want to make it look too messy. I mean, it is going to be blended in, but the thing is that once you start blending with a brush, a lot of the texture remains. It doesn't completely go away. So in order for me to avoid creating an ugly and unrealistic looking texture, I had to make sure that I was a little bit more patient when laying down those strokes, which will later be blended in. You can now see the blending process. I'm using a hard bristle brush for that, and it's really pushing the charcoal around and making the tone a little bit more even, but you can see that some of those lines and the texture is still there. I switched to a soft charcoal pencil, which is a little bit softer and obviously a little bit darker, and I'm using it to add some even darker tones to this hair. Manny Pacquiao has very dark hair, obviously, and I'm going to try to reflect that in my drawing. But of course, how dark or how light something looks depends on the amount of value of the areas around it. So in order for the dark here to stand out, it had to be darker than the background. But there are some highlights here on the hair, and I'm pulling those with a pencil eraser so that I could give that hair a little bit more structure and a bit more depth, so that it looks a little bit more three-dimensional. And of course, there's a lighter portion of the hair on the right where there is a nice contrast with the background. And there's going to be even more contrast with the right side of the face and the background. I'm starting to draw the eyes, and I zoomed in a little bit more. I'm using a very sharp medium charcoal pencil now. And the good thing about these woodless charcoal pencils is that they can be sharpened pretty well. Now here it's very important to get the shape of the eyes and his eyelids right. Otherwise it just won't look like him. And also the shape of his eyebrows will be just as important. Pacquiao has a very interesting face to draw, I have to say. And he's one of the more interesting characters in the boxing world, and certainly one of the most skillful boxers. Still active, has a big fight coming up. Floyd Mayweather has also had some of his fights recently, if you want to call them that. He had this exhibition with Logan Paul. I'm not really sure what that was, but I guess you could call it boxing. But Pacquiao still competes at a very, very high level. So you can see that I had to shade all of the eyeball, and the eyeball now looks a little bit too dark, but that's okay. I'm going to shade around it, and once I shade the rest of the face, and once I shade the eye socket, things will start to make a lot more sense, I think. The reason why I have to shade all of the eyeball is because, including the white of the eye, is because it's a round object, and because there's a highlight in the middle on the iris, and in order for that highlight to stand out even more, it needs to be surrounded by a sufficient amount of value. I'm doing some crude shading on his face. I'm not overly concerned about the texture of the skin right now. A lot of this is going to be blended in and covered with a little bit more value and a bit more cross-hatching. So right now I'm not too concerned about how ugly some of these lines look. Most of them will disappear or be blended in one way or another. So here it's time for me to try out some of my blending tools. I worked a little bit with a Q-tip to soften the texture on the forehead, and after that I switched to a tortilla for a little bit more control. I'm adding a bit more shadow under those bangs and around the temples. The eye socket area is always a little bit darker. Now I need to put a sufficient amount of value on the eyes and the eyelash area, because he has pretty long and pretty dark eyelashes, and his eyebrows are also fairly thick. And this transition between the nose and the forehead is also extremely important if you want to capture the likeness of the person. Noses are also a little bit difficult to draw. The nose is probably the most three-dimensional part of the face, so if you want to get it to look right, you need to shade it properly so that it doesn't appear either too wide or too pointy or too long, I guess. So there's a nasty shadow going down the middle of the nose and the highlight on the other side, so I'm going to have to tackle that eventually. But like I said, it's going to be very important if I want to get the shape of the nose right, because it's a very important part of achieving likeness in a person. Getting the sketch right is not enough to capture the likeness of the person. In fact, it's the least of your problems, really. It ultimately comes down to shading, especially that area of the face between the eyes and the nose and the eye socket area. But of course the lips are also very important. I've done the lips. I'm not too happy about them just yet. One of the things that I often struggle with is when there is some facial hair, I sometimes have difficulty understanding the shape of the mouth and the jaw area, but I'm going to try to fix it eventually. He also has these interesting wrinkles around the mouth and around the cheeks. A bit more shadow under the nose and a bit more shadow around the corners of the mouth, on the sides of the mouth, and of course a few more details on this goatee with a few flyaway hairs here and there. Notice I didn't do the other eye. That's probably not a good habit, because generally you're supposed to draw one right after the other and work on both at the same time. But sometimes I can make an exception, and I'm kind of going full circle, and but mostly going from left to right, I guess. Just putting some final details around this eye on the left, and correcting the shape of the eyebrows a little bit. Adding a bit more hair to the mustache and making those eyelashes a bit thicker. So basically, once I've done a lot of the shading process, I'm kind of going back and double checking whether the areas of darker value are big enough or dark enough in my drawing. And that's always a good idea to do, because the thing is that as you shade, as you progress with your portrait, you will often find that things change as the areas of darker value start to interact with the newly shaded areas, and they start to become smaller and lighter than they actually seemed at first. So it is this value interaction that causes the portrait to change a little bit. That's why you have to go back and kind of check whether you need to add a bit more value in some of the places you've already worked on. I'm adding a few more highlights to his hair on the right side. And I zoomed back in a little bit, and now I'm going to work on the other eye. I have to make sure that I can avoid any distortions, that I can avoid making him look cross-eyed. And that is danger here because of the shape of his eyes, especially the corners of the eyes. So I need to make sure that I shade the eyelid area properly. And one of the ways to check whether you're creating any distortions, especially around the eyes, is to look at your drawing in a mirror. That way you can more easily notice some of the problems with symmetry and proportions, or at least that's what often helps me. It often works for me. I think the portrait is coming along nicely. I'm mostly happy with the face, with the way the face looks so far, but there will be some minor tweaking done here and there. Now, as you can see, back to what I was saying about composition, I did a bit of shading on the background, and I wanted the lighter areas of his body, as you can see around the neck and the traps and the shoulder area, to stand out against the slightly darker background. But the drawing is going to be a vignette like most of my portraits, so it's I'm just going to fade the edges a little bit. But I didn't want to create a simple portrait, and I wanted to put the gloves in there as well. I'm doing a bit more shading on the body, even though I don't really need to put in too much detail there, because I'm going to be fading the lower part anyway. But once I'm done with that, I'm mostly going to have to focus on drawing those gloves, because those will need to be a bit more detailed as well, because after all they are in front of the body, so some of the viewer's focus is going to be drawn to them, so I can't oversimplify them. I am going to simplify them a little bit, but hopefully not too much. The black colored pencil that I used to refine some of the details on the face is Kohinoor Gioconda black pencil that I used in some of my previous drawings. It works well with charcoal, so I'm going to use it for some other details, like for example the letters here on the gloves. It says Pacman, but we can't see the P and A entirely. I also wanted to do the logo on the gloves first, but I decided against it eventually because I couldn't really make out all of the details, and I didn't really think that was important, so eventually I just simplified the appearance of the gloves and I removed those lighter areas and decided just to leave the Pacman text in there. So I established some mid-tone on the glove, and now I'm putting in some of the darker areas. I also put down a bit of vine charcoal, which is easily blended. Vine charcoal is good because it allows me to create these smooth transitions, and I need those because I want the gloves to appear fairly smooth and shiny, like they are made out of leather or some other similar material. And of course, in order to do that, I'm going to have a nice range of value and some nice transitions between the areas of darker and lighter value, and a few of these highlights where the gloves are reflecting a bit of light. I've done a few landscapes and some wildlife recently, so I felt that it was a time for a portrait, and I usually prefer drawing athletes rather than actors, I guess. And like I said, Manny Pacquiao is Very interesting character to draw, both in terms of his appearance and his personality. I'm doing a bit more refining on the glove on the left, and that's where this vine charcoal really comes in handy, because it allows you to shade without creating too much texture. And if you want to create a smoother looking surface, vine charcoal can help you with that. I also had to shade those letters a little bit, even though they are white, but because some of those letters are in the shadow, I needed to go over them a little bit with a brush so that I can add a bit more value there. And you can see how nicely these reflections on the glove stand out against the rest of the body. Value contrast is extremely important in drawing. And you can now see why, because this is what allows you to express volume, to show volume and depth in your drawing. And it allows the viewer, who may or may not know anything about drawing, to interpret that range of value as actual shapes, three-dimensional shapes. I moved on to the other glove and I'm going to be wrapping things up soon once I shade this one as well. I don't need the drawing to look perfect or perfectly neat. I can just simplify the appearance of the gloves a little bit, but the contrast will be far more important. The larger contrast will be far more important than the smaller details, in order to create a realistic looking appearance of the glove. If you like my videos, please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Comment, let me know what you think, give me some suggestions. I also forgot to include this small tattoo of a boxing glove on his chest, so I'm going to put that in as well. So comment, like, subscribe, all of that means a lot for my channel. Check out my other videos. I have lots of other portraits and drawings of athletes, and a few boxers and some MMA athletes as well. I'm going over this with a brush because I want a slightly blurrier edge. I don't want the tattoo to look too clean and too well defined. And just a bit of shading around the chest area, although I don't really need to put too much detail in there. If you want to see longer videos, you can check out my Patreon, where I have real-time footage and full-length narrated videos, as well as some other content. I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing a full-length narrated video for this one, but there's usually a lot of additional content there. I'm trying to decide where to put down my signature. It's going to be here on the right. And that's it. I think the drawing is done. I hope you like this portrait. Thank you for watching. Once again, don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.